Well, time to turn our attention to the business world, and Facebook finds itself friendless, at least in Russia, as a Moscow court brands the social media giant an extremist organization. And events in Ukraine are beginning to feed into the wider world economy as fertilizer prices hit a record high, and Egypt devalues its currency as a result of soaring food prices. Well, joining me to discuss these and other stories is Arise business correspondent Laurie Laird. Good to see you, Laurie. Let's start with Facebook, declared a terrorist organization, well, it's an extremist organization in Russia. Tell us more.
Yeah, this isn't a huge surprise, Charles, but it does put Facebook, you mentioned the word extremist, it puts it in the same category in the eyes of the Russian courts as the Taliban and ISIS. Both of these organizations also branded extremist organizations. But there's a little bit of a catch here because TASS, the Russian state agency, news agency, has said individuals who access Facebook will not be penalized, but companies that may use the advertising facility there will be viewed as funding terrorists or funding extremists. So it's roughly as we thought it would happen, but important, WhatsApp is still not banned.
Okay, well, let's move away from Facebook and its travails and talk about the big news from the oil markets. I understand there have been some threatening comments from Russia, but also some other movements.
That's right, Charles, and this has been brewing all day, and it's really starting to hit ahead, but it looks like some of the EU countries, which have been absolutely against banning any kind of crude imports from Russia, have said, wait a second, what's happening now in Ukraine, particularly in Mariupol, is so drastic that we really need to up sanctions. So we're hearing that France in particular is leading a bit of a push to ban Russian crude oil imports into the EU. This would be a massive, massive deal for Russia. The EU takes so much of its crude oil. And so essentially that is funding some of this war effort. Now, France, as I mentioned, is leading the charge. France can afford to do this. It relies on nuclear power. Ireland also behind this move, not a big importer of Russian crude. Now, whether they can bring Germany on board, you really need Germany for approval for a big move like this, is still an open question. But certainly things are starting to move that way. It's really pushed up the price of oil. We're back up to $105, up 6% today, and hanging out there on the highs of the day.
Well, let's talk about the money that Russia owes. What's the latest on those bond payments? Because there is a Russian payment due today, isn't there? We are not sure if they're paying in rubles or dollars, or if they're paying at all.
Or if they're paying at all. No word yet on whether any payment has been authorized. Remember, we had a big payment last week. We didn't learn that had been authorized until very late in the day. And it's only now that lenders are starting to receive last week's interest payment. But as you say, this one's really important. It's only 66 million, about half of what needed to be paid last week. But there's a clause on this bond issue, and Russia can pay this one in rubles. Now, rubles are so devalued, no one wants to hold anything in rubles. Plus, if rubles were to go into, let's say, any bank, say Citibank, for sake of argument, can they touch those rubles, or is that under sanctions? So nobody wants to deal in rubles, and I think whatever decision Russia makes here, it will be symbolic. If they pay this in dollars, it's sort of a clue that they want to stay within the Western financial system. In ruble sounds a very different message.
And talking about bonds and so on, the stock exchange in Moscow has reopened partially. I mean, does that suggest that things are starting to return to normal?
I'd say it doesn't. Russia, only a very limited number of Russian bonds traded today. Head of the stock exchange says we're ready to trade stocks, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. And Russian stocks that are trading on other exchanges went from multi-billion-dollar companies to penny stocks overnight. I don't think Russia will be in a hurry to reopen its trading to equities.
Right, and we've got about 30 seconds or so. Egypt's devalued its currency because of the higher cost of wheat. I mean, clearly this is affecting economies further afield, the Ukraine crisis.
And this is such an important point. Egypt imports crude oil, imports wheat, imports fertilizer, the price of which is at a record high, had to devalue its currency and raise interest rates. This is not the first African country, Charles, that is not the last African country that's going to have to do this.
Laurie, thanks very much indeed. Laurie Laird, Arise business correspondent there.